Carl's address is 1040 Cooper Terrace, Port Charlotte, Florida. His telephone number is area code 813-697-0776. Carl maintains an apartment in Holt. His phone number is area code 517-694-2142. The recording was made by Jim Walkinshaw and Helen Earley of the Oldsmobile History Center at 4000 North Grand River in Lansing, Michigan, on November 23rd, 1988. This is tape number 1 of 2 tapes. Okay, Carl, why don't you just start with your name and address and phone number and so forth.
My name's Carl Wardell. I live in Port Charlotte, Florida. My address is 1040 Cooper Terrace. My phone number is area code 813-697-0776.
Okay. Do you have a local address here in Lansing that
I
you
have an apartment in Holt, out on Aurelius Road, and my phone number there is 694-2142.
Okay. Good. Then maybe, Carl, you could just start us back when you came to Oldsmobile, when you hired in, when was that, and what you were doing, and take us from there.
Why did you come to Oldsmobile instead of Chrysler or Ford or some other business?
I started at Olds on February 15th, 1955. I came to Oldsmobile because I was a local boy. I was born and raised in DeWitt, attended school there. My family, many of them worked at Oldsmobile, and it was seemed like the place to start. I started to work in the blueprint room.
In product?
In product engineering, working for Woody Breeding and Herb Henning. And I worked in there, starting on the trimming table, worked our way up through all of the jobs in there. Was there for about 4 years. From the blueprint room, I went out and worked in the release area for Hugh Burns and Don Perkins.
Okay.
And I was there about a year and a half. When I hired in, I was hired by George Hirschman, who was an administrative engineer. And George was replaced by Claire Harrington.
Mm-hmm.
Claire came in from Rochester, I believe, where he was comptroller. And he wanted to come back to Lansing, so they brought him back to Lansing and put him in as administrative engineer. And while I worked for Hugh Burns, I started working on budgets for Claire Harrington in the evenings. I put together his budgets. And I did that for a year and a half or so. And about that time, we started building the engineering building, the new engineering building, Building 66. And Claire was kind of in charge of what was happening with the new engineering building. Bob Summers also, was a building engineer. So during the day, I worked on my regular job, and then I worked on a building, Building 66 at nights.
So what was that, a 2 8-hour shift job,
It was
sort of?
a lot of 2, 3 o'clock in the morning job, going home. And well, it got down to, we wanted to get in there on December 15th. You worked on that, so you remember that. And we wanted to be moved in there on December 15th, 1961. And the last few months, there was, it was around the clock. And so I worked for Claire Harrington and Bob Summers at nights on the building. Meanwhile, during the day, my job was changing some because after I started working on budgets, I went to work for Harrington. I got off the release job and I went to work for Claire Harrington, and I did the budgets. I was in charge of the engineering budget. Also about this time, there was a young guy by the name of Tom Morton that worked there, and he worked for John Belts. And he did car comparisons and cost analysis, piece costs, stuff like that. So I, during the day, started doing a lot of work for Tom Morton. And in the process of doing this, I got quite familiar with costing and competitive cars. I did a lot of competitive car analysis. And Tom decided that he left General Motors, and I took over his job. This was in 62, 3, somewhere in there.
Were you reporting directly to John Belts?
No, I was reporting to Claire Harrington, who was administrative engineer.
I see.
But then I started doing, after Morton left, I got rid of the budget, and another person took over the budget, and I was in charge. I took over doing car comparisons, piece cost comparisons, competitive car comparisons, and car shows. Did a lot of car shows.
What's a car show?
Well, we used to have the new cars every year. I'd set them up in an appearance analysis room. After we built Building 66, we used to use that appearance analysis room for car shows. And I'd set up all the new cars and make out questionnaires and invite a lot of people in, employees, and what they thought of the new cars. This was like in February, before their introduction, you know, the fiberglass cars. And I asked them to fill out a questionnaire and come in, and then I compiled the results of those questionnaires, and we'd go through them and see what our employees thought of next year's cars. Of which we made a lot of changes from what we had to what they thought we should have. So, you know, the changes that could be made that we felt were good criticism and were financially possible and timely, you know, that could be made in that length of time. And then in that same time frame, I started doing lead time shows, long lead shows. And we used to have shows out at the proving grounds for competitive car shows. You remember the competitive car shows where we had all... I started working on those when they were originated. I was the Olds person who took care of that.
When would that have been about, Carl?
Oh, boy. Early 60s.
Okay.
Early 60s.
Well, what did they do before that? Didn't look at other guys' cars?
Well, I don't think they did them on that scale.
Okay.
We would have various car comparisons. I think I started those, though, at Oldsmobile, where I would bring in, say, Ford products, current Ford products, and take whatever the comparative car was for Oldsmobile and set it side by side. And then we'd take it front, side, rear, interior, and mechanical, and match each car against the other and give it a value. We'd give those advantages or disadvantages, whatever they might be, a value. And then when we got down to the bottom, I would add up all those values and put in the list price of each car, see what the differences were in list price, and see how we matched up value-wise. And this was 61, 2, 3, somewhere
Well,
back
how
in
did
there.
you get those cars? Would you go out and buy them from a dealer?
No.
How did you get those competitive cars?
Well, locally the dealers would give them to me. I knew all the local dealers. And if they were foreign cars, I'd have to rent them out of dealerships. And we also had cars for competitive drives that I would rent. I would rent those. Say we wanted to look at, well, we didn't have Japanese cars back then, but say we wanted to look at Chrysler products versus the Oldsmobile, I'd go out and rent whatever number of cars we needed and set out a course to drive, and we'd prep the cars and then take off and on the course and drive them and compare them.
Now, would that be a local course, or would you take 200, 300, 400 miles on a trip?
No, they wouldn't be that far normally. The ones held in Lansing would have been short courses.
Just driving around town? Or?
Well, usually outside of town. You get away from the traffic. And a lot of them were west of town. We'd go out west of town. And sometimes down at the proving grounds, around the grounds, or off the grounds.
Who would do the driving, Carl? What kinds of folks?
Well, this was at in the era of John Belts, and there would be the chief engineer, the assistant chiefs, the divisional engineers, and right engineers, the interior guys, Dick Steele, and George Jones, and Dustin, and back in the engine guys that would be there at that time would have been Burl and Tom Leonard.
All product folks, however.
Usually, but sometimes there would be marketing people. There, Pat Flanders.
Okay.
Perhaps PR person, Jack White or whoever it was back at that time.
Would you drag down people from the central office area or not?
A little later.
Okay.
I started working with what was the first product program type people, Quackenboss and, oh boy, my memory is going to pieces here. Well, they were the first people down there in the product planning type department. Joe Kovich. Quackenboss and Kovich were the two guys that started that department back in, oh golly, 61. Probably 61, 62.
And they were in GM marketing?
They were in GM, central office, yes.
But not marketing.
I don't think they called it marketing at that time. I believe it was called...
Sales promotion?
No.
No. Probably engineering of some kind.
Well, Quackenboss was an engineer.
Current product engineering.
You think? What we called that department?
Market analysis?
It was... No, it was more of a planning department. It's where they first started planning. Central office started planning what your division might have 5 years down the road. And that was a small group of people at that time. Like Quackenboss ran it. Joe Kovich worked for him. They had a computer in the department, a big computer for that time, and a secretary, and that was it.
That was part of I'm sure it was part of the product engineering side of the house, not the sales side of the house.
Well, I wouldn't say that for sure.
I don't think so. Huh?
Because along with that, there was a group down there that used to do clinics, and used to put out these performance books that would, can't think of what they call them, where every customer got a thing to fill out. He'd fill that out, they compiled that information and put it in this satisfaction index. I want to say PSI, but I don't think that was what it was called. Satisfaction study.
Satisfaction index.
Yeah, was that it?
I think it was customer satisfaction index.
CSI. That's
Yes.
it. Yeah. And that was a sales-oriented thing. These people, I don't quite know how they fit into that.
That's okay. You don't have to chase the guys down there.
they were the originators of what I would call, the current large group down there that where they started changing the strategy of how and what the divisions were going to build.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, design staff and engineering pretty much decided what was going to be built, and the general manager.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of emphasis on the engineering department.
Mm-hmm.
The old story is that we would design them, you would build them, and the sales department would sell them. And nobody talked to anybody in between.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is when it had gotten to change, and they were beginning to tell people, here's what you were going to have. And it grew into what we got now. Anyway, I worked with them quite often, and they would come down to Oldsmobile, and Belts would always get involved with these people when they came down. And they'd put on a presentation, here's what we got in mind 5 years down the road. We think we should be selling these kind of cars, and they will cost this much, and they will compete with these people. And that started in the early 60s.
Okay. Hey, Carl, back up a minute. I don't want to screw up your train of thought, but you were talking about releasing ahead of that when you first sort of started. Take us through the process that went on in the 50s for releasing parts.
Well, everything was done by hand.
Okay.
And we used to have what we call productions. They'd deliver these prints into the blueprint room in a package, and they call them a production. And you would run a number of prints on these productions, which we coded by colors. And that would tell you who was going to get those prints and releases. And we used to have like red, yellow, salmon, blue. Red was 26, and yellow was 4, and salmon was 1, and blue was, I don't remember, 10 or something like that. That was the number of prints you ran. And that was the number of people that received those out in purchasing, manufacturing, wherever the department might be. And along with these prints went a release. And they were, the release was prepared out in Irv Henning's group by a number of release writers. And the releases were printed, brought into the blueprint room. Well, they were printed in the blueprint room. And the blueprint room's responsibility was to provide them with a release and a print, if they got them, to the correct people, and they were mailed. They were run and mailed out in there. And the releases were developed out in Irv Henning's group, and I just named some of the people that were out there then. Mr. Irv Henning ran the department. George Halpin worked for Irv, and they both worked here for about 50 years apiece. And Pat Stump was the secretary out there. Russ Spaulding worked out there, Jim McKeon, George Ritz, Ray Stewart. I'm sure I'm missing some. It's been a long time ago.
Carl, the engineer would do his thing and figure out what it took and hand that group a piece of paper and say, go do something?
Well, they handed it to another group, really.
Okay.
The engineer would say it was a new part. The drawing would be made. The group leader out in the drawing room would fill out a sheet of paper giving the details of this part, what was going to be happening to it. And it would go to Hugh Burns, who, there was two types of release, experimental releases and production releases. Basically what I was talking to you earlier about were all production releases. There was also experimental releases, which lots of times went out earlier, before they were finally released for production, and they would, from those releases, they'd build cars over an experimental assembly. And those were done by Hugh Burns, the guy that I worked for. They would come out of the early drawings would come out of the drafting room to Hugh, and we would have to write up a release and give it, make a parts list that they could build a car from, and a release and an index. We would index each one of those parts, and that release would be sent out with prints to basically within the engineering building for building of experimental cars and testing of parts. And every time, until that thing became a production piece, it would probably keep that experimental index. Now, experimental indexes were like numbers. 31A, we'll say, would be an index number of a part that came out. And that part might be changed 3 or 4 times in that in its experimental life. And the next time it came out, maybe you'd keep it in the same family. It might, but it would say 31B.
Okay.
Because you changed the part enough where it changed it physically, where it would require the people to know that it wasn't the same part as they got the first time.
So it performed the same sort of function.
It was the same part, went to the same place, did the same function, but it had been changed. And so they would need to know that there was a newer part, and they should replace that part on the cars that they were testing. Well, it would tell them that. And if they were to dispose of the old parts. So you give it keep it in the same family, but you give it a new number. And then those same parts would be released for production after they had been tested and approved for production, sampled and all that stuff would happen. We'd release them for production. And the experimental release was a blue release, so you could, and the production release was pink. So you could look at them and and you'd know this was experimental release, this was production release. And then it would be released for production. And when it was released for production, probably be given a production index. And that started out with a P, and maybe it would be PA. That would be the production release. But you could change those production releases too through that department, and maybe the parts had a habit of being changed a lot, and if they changed enough so PA parts were no longer acceptable, we'd give it a new index of PB.
When did it get its part number? 463-197.
Oh, when it became a production part.
Okay.
But that's not a solid rule.
Yeah, but generally.
Generally, when it became a production, when it was going to production, it would go from an X number, XA, XB, XC, XD, XE, XR. That was A size, B size, C size, D size, E size, or roll. They would become 567, 142 type numbers.
Yeah, okay. Well, just a little bit of diversion there, but curious to see. Now we'll see how that changes over the years.
I don't believe we have experimental numbers anymore, do we?
Probably true.
I've been going a while, but I don't think they use them anymore. That's the way we did it back then.
Yep. Okay, back to the budget end of the business, or wherever you were there.
Well, let's see, where was I?
You were working with Claire Harrington and setting up the displays and that sort of thing.
Well, I spent quite a few years doing car shows. I did car shows starting in the early 60s, and I was still doing car shows when I retired. I changed jobs many times in between, but I could never seem to get rid of that job.
Did any funny little things happen in a car show?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if they were funny. There was a lot of,
Well, or machinations, or whatever you call them.
well, you know, when we were doing shows like long lead shows and board of directors shows, you weren't allowed to screw up. They had to be right. And basically, you went through them so many times and checked everything so many times that there was very few, I can't even remember a bad goof up in all those years. It just wasn't allowed. You'd been demoted back to blueprint room. But,
How much would those board of directors shows cost when you were working on them, Carl?
geez, Helen, they were very expensive, but I don't remember numbers. Basically, they were expensive because of artwork and slides. It was very difficult to please everyone. You know, if you had to do a show and you only did it for one person, that wouldn't be too hard because you'd know that person, you know what he liked, and but the problem with these things was that you'd work with maybe John Belts and satisfy him, and then about 2 weeks or a week before the show, he'd invite 15 other people in there, and they all felt they had to critique what you did, and if they didn't say anything, they wouldn't get invited again, you know, so they wanted to change everything. They ended up doing everything 3 or 4 times. But
That's when they used those large glass slides.
we used lantern slides
Lantern slides.
back in those days, yeah.
Did you get to be in the back room running a few of those?
I usually ran the machine. Yeah.
Did you have any backroom occurrences that were rather frightening?
Oh yeah, you know, and all those times you'd have a lamp that would burn out. You'd put one in backwards.
Down.
At that same time, we did in about 1965. We went around the country, and Bob Summers did more of that than I did, but I did quite a bit of it. We went around the country and gave shows on the new Tornado. And we used lantern slides with those, and we used 2 projectors. And they were all manual, you know. You put the slide in, slid it in, and you had to pull the other one out. You should have had about 4 hands. And
Who would you give these shows to?
oh, they give them to everybody. Rotary clubs. And,
The public rather than dealers.
oh, yeah. Yeah, they did them all over the country. And it was traveling sideshows, what it was. Run today, you're going to be in Minneapolis. Tomorrow, you're going to be in Green Bay, and from there, you're going to go to South Bend or Rochester, New York. You know, just, around the country. So, Belts gave some of them. Harrington gave a lot of them. That was 1964 and 5, I guess. So we came out with a new Tornado in 66.
Right.
65 year, 66 model year. I don't know where we're at in this thing. About that same time, I did a pitch. We were all trying to get a new garage at the Proving Grounds in Milford. And I remember going out there. We had an old garage alongside Hydromatic, which it was across from what was a Chevrolet garage then, and just a little building. And all the divisions were vying to get that first new garage. And I went out and did that. Ted Lucas was out there then in his garage as a Milford Proving Ground engineer, and put together a booklet on it, slides, and we got the garage. I was kind of pleased with that. I was very happy with that. About that time, I started going out to the Desert Proving Grounds every winter with next year's cars to shoot photography, which was used by everybody in the world. We used them for long lead shows. We used it for a board of directors show, and I put on a pitch every year for the sales department, public relations, and the ad agency. And I do this in about December to
Okay, we're back on.
this, I would put together all of the new features for the following year, so the sales department and the ad agency could do their work for the upcoming year. They could plan what type of advertising they were going to have as far as what they were going to emphasize as new features. I'd have slides and pictures that I'd give the sales and advertising people that they could use for reference. And basically the agency only used it for reference because they were never of the quality, according to them, that they could use, plus there was no 17% if I did it.
Who picked the pictures?
Pardon me?
Did you pick what you're going to take?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'd take the vehicles out there and I'd find the location, and many times I would take a photographer with me.
Okay.
And normally the photographer I took was Roger Betcher, because he was local. Well, I knew Roger since we were kids, so you know that we got along good and that worked fine. But that was done in December for the ad agency and the salespeople and PR. And then shortly thereafter, usually January or February, the fleet buyers would come in. For fleet sales, for ordering, they were always the first people to order cars the following year. They got the first shot of cars off, you know, for the fleets. And I would do shows for all of the fleet companies when they came in. And it was a shorter version of what I gave to the ad agency.
Now, would those be done in the auditorium? Where would you
They were done in two places. Many of them would be done in engineering in the conference room. And after the new new administration building was completed, they would usually be done on the 5th floor conference room.
Oh, yes.
Prior to that, they were done in engineering.
Okay.
But all with slides.
Pardon me?
All with pictures, slides.
Yes, yes. The sales and engineering one was given by, while I wrote it, it was given by the assistant chief engineers. They were given the task of presenting it. I think I usually wrote them all, and of course prepared the slides, so all they had to do was get up, and they were more qualified to answer the questions. But the ones later with the fleet buyers, I did solely by myself. That continued for until we'll say 1971. And at that time, I continued to do all the shows, but I also took on the extra work of approving advertising.
Why was that?
Well, the government got really involved about that time, and the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, got involved that you had to document any claim that was made in advertising. And of course I furnished dimensions back from 1961 to sales and PR, whoever, for anything that was put out. I furnished those dimensions and specifications, and basically I was the engineering person responsible for communicating with public relations and sales. So things that, anything that they got was supposed to go through me to make sure it was technically correct. So that I started that in the early 60s.
Okay.
And so on it was natural that when all of the ads, all of the brochures, everything that PR put out had to first go through my department in engineering for approvals before it went out, and through the legal staff. And this started in '71, and it went through me before it would go to legal staff. Legal wouldn't really accept anything unless I sent it down there with a sheet that had my approvals on it. And every year, before brochures went out, I had to go down and sit with the lawyers and go through and say I had documentation for this, and yes, this was correct. So, and I had to keep a file on everything that went out for 7 years.
For the legal
For the
aspects
legal
of stuff.
implications on it, yes.
Did that, now, because you probably didn't have knowledge of everything on every part of the car, you must have had to send a lot of that back and forth to engineers, and how did you get the data that was necessary?
There wasn't all that much that I didn't know, really. The kind of claims that you would make required, maybe I would go sit down with the guy that was responsible for that part, and I worked close with all of the engineers for all those years.
Yeah.
And I would say maybe 20% of the stuff I had to go check on. The rest of it I would know.
Because it was generalized, sort of somewhat general.
It was fairly, it wasn't technical in regards to it was generally pretty not watered down, but
it's available for the public,
yeah,
so to speak. So
you wouldn't give out technical
right,
anything that they couldn't understand. So you know, it's stuff that you would see in an ad, but you had to be careful that you couldn't read something else into it that wasn't there. So you wanted to make sure that it was not only technically correct, but could not be misconstrued to mean something else. All those years I had only one problem.
What was that?
The engine change.
The Chevrolet engine?
Chevrolet engine thing, yeah. I wrote a letter telling the sales department not to call it an Olds engine. It was not to call it a rocket engine. And of course, when we got in that mess, they got a hold of that letter. And I think it helped us in the end. It showed good faith that we were not trying to
sneak it through.
Yeah. So the lawyers were happy with that. I wasn't very happy when I had to go sit in front of them, but that was...
Did you get dragged into court with that thing?
Well, just for deposition. Not into court, no. Dorshimer had to go into court.
Dorshimer went into court. I bet he loved that.
Yeah, he wasn't very happy with that. That was basically, of all those years, the only real problem that we had. Oh, we had your day-to-day problems, you know, but really never got any legal problems. I was always pleased of the success we had with that program. And there was a lot of people who did have problems as far as the FTC questioning. I used to get calls from the networks before they'd run an ad, they would ask me, is this true? Is it all right for us to run that? And then they would run it. So I got to know a lot of people, and it was a fun job. Had way too much work for the people that we had. Had some really good people.
What people come to your mind?
Well, Bob Hicks worked for me for a number of years, and I always had, as the GMI students went through, I got every one of them that ever went through there for years, at least once. And, had a lot of good guys and gals throughout the years that helped.
Carl, what, in your estimation, or who was the engineer you enjoyed working with the most?
The chief engineer?
Chief engineer.
Well, I had two that I thought an awful lot of. John Belts was the first guy I worked with, and I was a young guy, young kid, and he kind of baptized me. If you remember John Belts, we only had one. He only got after me once, really got after me, but he was a super smart person, and it was very unfortunate for him, of course, and really for GM that he died at such a young age, because there's no doubt in my mind that John Belts would have ran General Motors. Quite frankly, he's done a lot better job than some other people did. But Howard Carroll was a very, very good guy as far as myself looking for him. He was a fellow that didn't start at Oldsmobile, and many people didn't cooperate with him like they should have, maybe because he was a Chevrolet person. But Howard Carroll, I enjoyed immensely. He gave me more work than 10 guys could do. But he always was appreciative of the work you did, and I thought very highly of Howard Carroll. The guy, I had all kinds of bosses. I had many, many, many bosses. I had, not just because I'm talking to that thing. I'd tell anybody that. I really never had a bad boss. They were all different, but all good people that I just enjoyed immensely. I could go down through every boss I had, I think, from start to finish. I remember them all really well. All fine people.
Carol, on the long lead shows that we used to hold at Milford, which of the writers was, in your estimation, the most difficult to work with? Does anyone stand out in your mind?
Yeah, and I can't remember his name. Remember, you know the one I mean. He would take things out of context. Remember the time Walt Freiberg got in trouble with that writer? It was the same one. I can't remember his name.
He always brought his 10-year-old son,
brought his kid
Teddy with him.
Yeah, that was probably the most difficult guy I
It'll
ever
come.
knew. I can't remember his name.
No, it'll come to me. I can't think of it either.
They were all a different type of breed than what we were used to, They were... Those magazine guys and the magazines, I didn't think ever really represented the auto industry.
Why do you say that?
Well, basically they were always looking for something that, and many of them thought they could find on foreign cars, and if you didn't have it, your car didn't amount to very much. They would come in there and listen to the pitch and spend 10 minutes, go away, many of them, and write up whatever they had to write up on a piece of paper, and half of them never looked at the cars that you had. I don't know. It was not, that job with the long lead show was something we had to do, and I didn't enjoy it very much.
Do you ever remember the safety people coming out and telling a rider to stop driving a car like that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. They used to come out, what was his name? Oh, gee. Out at the proving grounds. He'd come out there and take him right out of the car. Say, you're not driving anymore. Or they would shut you down. Oh, yeah, the guy...
From our place?
From the proving
Well, it was a
ground.
proving grounds.
Proving grounds.
Oh, I can tell you his name in just a minute.
I couldn't remember his name, but I thought that happened.
Oh, yeah, and it used to happen a lot when we'd take our guys out there.
Oh.
You know, we'd have our guys out there to drive cars every year.
Like our employees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Art Weedman was always getting in trouble with him.
What was he doing?
Oh, Art just drive the wheels off the car, you know. And it was, he probably knew what he was doing, but there would be other people that wouldn't have been as talented at driving the car as Art was, you know, because they weren't all people that were familiar with the proving grounds, and had to be careful. And Doc.
Yes.
Oh, Doc. He was in charge of the proving grounds out there anyway, of that portion of the proving grounds. And
Alex Wallerdy is the man we're trying to think of.
Yeah, that's the guy.
That's the writer?
Writer.
That's the writer. Yeah. Doc, I don't remember Doc's last name. But anyway, he'd shut it down. He'd just say, no more driving.
Then you just shut the whole thing off.
Well, they're very strict out there, you know. They're very conscious of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And if he felt it was not safe, boy, that was the end of it.
Then you come back the next day and go on again?
Yeah.
Do you remember any incidents where someone was injured or killed?
Or hurt?
Or performing some of the tests that they do on the grounds?
Well, the one I remember was back in the 50s when, remember the Firebird, the original Firebird show car? Back in the 50s, early 50s, mid-50s, we used to build, General Motors used to build a lot of show cars.
Motorama cars.
Yes. And one was a Firebird. I believe it was Curtis. Nah, I'm not sure it was Curtis. One of the vice presidents ran one off the track.
See, that was a turbine-powered car, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was about 55, 56, somewhere in there. Oh, it wasn't Curtis, was it?
Well, let's see.
That's the only one I remember of anyone. They got hurt. I don't think they got killed. That's the only one I remember. I don't really remember.
Any of our guys, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I can remember accidents unfortunate accidents that happened to our engineers. C. Schofield hit a little kid one time out by Diamonddale and came out from behind a bus or something and killed a little kid. And Jim Lewis got in an accident one time going to Detroit with a bunch of guys that were headed up to the coal, Campus Casing up for coal starts. Oh, we had a number of accidents where, you know, people piled up cars, but basically they were not done on the proving grounds. They were done on the roads. I don't remember much happening at the proving grounds as far as, you know, we kept track of the miles, and they were always trying to get to 1,000,000 miles without an accident. And that was, an accident meant, if you put a ding in a car, that was an accident. That ruined your record.
Start over.
So you started over. So they were very, very careful.
What's your educational background, Carl?
Well, basically, I started to work at Oldsmobile when I was 17 years old.
Where?
Right out of high school.
Where?
When I started in the blueprint room, I started right.
I see.
And I went to night school. And I went to GMI for a while, but I never finished and got a degree.
What would have been your degree if you'd persisted?
Well, it would have been in engineering.
Mechanical or?
Yeah. I always regretted that. I still do, that I didn't finish. But it was one of those things where I had a chance to go to GMI full time. I was married, had a couple kids. I bought a house, and I was going to night school. And that meant if I went to GMI full time, I would have had to sold the house. And I just never did. I never finished. And I regret that a whole lot. Still do.
But you've had an interesting career. How did you get into special vehicles from engineering?
Well, you mean where I'm at now?
Yes, but weren't you over there before?
Oh, well, I was across the hall in with.
You were still on the engineering people?
I was still in the engineering. I still worked in engineering at that time. When I worked across from Dave there, I was the office manager and the fleet manager for Auto Current. When I was over there, we had the quality. We had a bunch of young quality engineers. Plus, I still did all the shows, and I prepared all of the cars for upcoming years. See, I built those cars, and this was after reorganization. That's a gap in here. I jumped from one thing to another, but I prepared the following year's cars for the writers. PR used to borrow them, and if they wanted to give a car to a writer, they wanted to make sure that the guy got a good car, and it was representative of whatever he was interested in. So I prepared all those cars, and we also used those cars for the shows. And after reorganization, those cars were being built all over the place. I spent a lot of time in Flint and a lot of time in Detroit, and wherever the cars were being engineered and built, I had to spend time with those people to make sure that they were being built correctly to our specs. That was, I was lucky enough to have that from the beginning. And that first couple years of that was a real challenge.
Now, the special vehicle side of the thing, though, what got involved with that, or what was all of that about?
Well, it goes back. Going back to starting on that, from doing the shows and everything, when Dorshimer became chief engineer, it got to a point where there was a real crunch on money. And this was in the mid-70s, I guess. He decided that what I was doing was not benefiting the engineering department, but was benefiting the sales department and public relations, and that if they wanted that, they should be paying for it. And therefore, he says, I want you working for me and not them. And so I got a new assignment. I got to be the production readiness person for engineering.
Which is what?
Well, I was responsible for making sure that all of the parts were released, tooled, and sample approved when we said they were going to be, and so they made production on time.
So you were the schedule chaser.
That was part of it. Now, along with that, I also got the responsibility of specialty cars. Now, specialty cars were always somebody's idea of something that they needed, somebody in the sales department, but it became engineering's responsibility to get them designed, released, and built. And at that point, when I took over that job, there was a lot of tension because the sales department would say that we're going to have a 442. And they were going to build 10,000 442s. They wanted those 442s available on March 1st. And so in September, somebody would get this idea, and they'd sit down and say, well, here's what we want on this 442, and we want it to look like this, and we want to sell it, we want it in the dealer's hands on March 1st. So I inherited that, to make sure those were in the dealer's hands on March 1st. And so what I did, I'd start out with what it took to make that 442. I'd list all the parts, and you know, I did a critical path on the thing is what I did. And I followed it all the way through the building it. And it got to the point, one year I think I had 24 of them.
24 specialty cars?
I had 2 sheets of them. It was nothing but specialty cars that the sales department decided they needed. And you never had enough time. It's something that you should think of a year and a half, 2 years in advance at least. And you were lucky to get 6 months. Mm-hmm. We missed a few, but we made most of them. And, the sales department would get very upset. You know, they'd get out all their publicity and say this car is going to be available, and have advertising, everything, you know, to pitch this car. It wasn't going to get no built. Some of them never got built back there, you know.
Really?
Right? Yeah. Some of them never got built. They would have problems that would delay them to the point where they'd be in next year's production, so they wouldn't even get built. But, and we had a general managers meeting once a month. And I was always the poor sucker that got to report on those things, you know, to the general manager, why we weren't...
Who was general manager then?
Well, there was Sanchez and Cook. Who was before Sanchez?
Well, Cook preceded Sanchez, didn't he? Yes.
Yeah. It was... Bob Cook was the guy when I had that
He came
job.
after Sanchez.
Who did?
Cook.
No.
No.
He didn't?
No.
'Cause after
Sanchez
Sanchez,
replaced Cook, and then Bill Lane.
Bill Lane came.
Oh, yes. Well then,
Baker?
Baker and then...
Baker never showed up here.
Belts.
Baker, well, see, Baker, Belts, Metzel, Carroll are all
Wolfram,
back in
Skinner.
there. Yeah. So
Back up.
Maybe that's the way it goes.
Yeah, well, at the time we had the production readiness deal. It was Cook.
Yeah.
Luckily, you know, the guy that understood those kind of things.
Yeah, he came from that side,
Yeah.
so.
But I did that for 4.5 years.
Well, that was a good job. No?
Well, of all the jobs I had while I was there, it's probably the one I liked the least.
Okay. It was a paying job.
Yeah, it was a job that you never got patted on the back and said a good job. The only thing you ever got was kicked in the rear when something wasn't done on time.
Yeah.
And you had to deal with everybody. You know, I started out with the guy that had the idea for the car. You had the guy that designed it. He had to get it designed in time, and then you had to release it, and then you had to go to the purchasing back up in here someplace, you know, and get them working on the thing, and then you had to get sample approval, and then you had to get the plant to make it, and get parts there. So, you know, you were everything. I mean, basically, you were a gopher. And, except when it came time, you know, the car wasn't being built on the day it was supposed to be built, and then you were the guy that was responsible for the whole thing not being there.
Chief Goat.
Yeah. No, it was a job I enjoyed the least.
Would Hurst Olds come under that?
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, I did those things before I ever had that.
Yes.
I did specialty cars. You know, I was the kind of guy that put all those cars together. But I didn't have to... I was the guy that worked on the concept cars and would build those cars. But I didn't... Back in those days, I didn't have to worry about production cars. That was somebody else's worry.
So you were building the very first few, so to
Yeah,
speak, putting
well,
together
yeah.
those, yeah.
And I worked with Carson Concepts and Hearst before that, and American Sunroof, and the outside guys.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Pearl, we aren't having Hearstles, are we?
Oh, we haven't had a Hearstles in
88.
well, we hadn't had one in a long time that I can remember.
Well, we had this 20th century commemorative.
20th anniversary.
When was it?
20th anniversary aerial commemorative.
What year was it?
1988. It's this package deal that they're building down in Texas and putting
I'm
on.
not even familiar with it.
Well, it's supposed to fit Hearstles from 1981 on through.
I haven't even seen anything on it. I don't even know anything about it.
Well, see, it's really not a true Hearstles.
Yeah. Well, Hearst, I didn't even think Hearst existed anymore as a company, doesn't,
No,
Car-
Mr. Gasket bought them.
yeah.
And then Doc Watson has got he's taken over Mr. Gasket, I understand, and they're in Texas.
But it's
Mr.
not the old
Gasket?
Hearst Performance that used
No.
to...
No, but
No,
he's...
Carson Concept bought them out, I think.
Yeah, no,
Wasn't
Mr. Carson Concepts was sold to Mr. Gasket.
Yeah, recently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but didn't Hearst disappear as Hearst was once known?
Yes,
I
I
mean-
see what you see. Well, he passed away, of course,
Yeah.
George Hearst.
Linda's still around. I saw her this summer.
Yes, Linda Vaughn.
I see her at the races.
So Oldsmobile doesn't really have any specialty cars now, do we? What would you call specialty cars now in our 89 lineup?
Not like we had then. There are some, I think, that the dealer organizations put together, but they're basically just,
Cosmetic jobs?
yeah. No, I wouldn't say that we had any similar to those things, those specialty cars that we had back then.
1988. This is tape number 2 of 2 tapes. Okay, back on
But
again.
you're still with specialty cars,
No,
no?
no.
Your assignment now is...
My assignment now is the racing. I handle the racing series for Oldsmobile.
What does that entail?
Well, it's NASCAR, NHRA, IMSA, SCCA racing.
Yeah.
I deal with the owners and drivers that drive Oldsmobile vehicles.
Do we support that in some
We
manner?
do support that. Yes, we do support
Like-
that. We support that in parts and financial help and any expertise that we can help them with as far as aero testing or...
About hopping up engines and that kind of stuff?
Well, basically, most of these people have their own engine builders.
Okay, so they aren't worried about Oldsmobile engines?
No, not really, except there are some. There are some that do. The Quad 4 is becoming quite popular in the showroom stock type racing. We're winning races with that, and it's getting quite a bit of publicity, and I think we're going to do more of that.
People come in and ask you how to get a little bit more out of it and that sort of thing?
Well, basically, the old engineering people would work more with that than we would.
Okay.
But I do have a couple fellows that work for me that do have the expertise in that area that can help them.
Or you point them at product engineering, engine guys, if you get those kinds of
More
questions?
so than we have in the past, probably, because they are doing development work in that area. But other than the road racing series, engine builders are usually utilized by each team. They have their own engine builders to provide engines for their vehicles.
So our support is more on the body and chassis side, so to speak?
Well, we support them with engine parts through GM. And all of the parts that, any of the parts that they may need. And right now, most of our all of our NASCAR people in the Winston Cup are running Cutlass Spring type cars. And in the Busch Series, they are running either Cutlass Spring or Delta 88s. And of course, the NHRA type racers, we have Pro Stock, funny cars, and the whole gamut of drag racing. Which, by the way, we've won the Manufacturers' Cup 4 years in a row. So we're quite successful.
Where does that cup reside?
Well, I think Bill Lane's got a couple of them. I've got 5 or 6 of them in my office.
Oh, we support them too in publicity, or don't we do that now?
We do. We work with them. They work with us. We get a great deal of publicity out of the racing programs. Quite frankly, we only do it for one reason. We do it to sell cars.
Make money.
Yeah.
And they feel it does.
Oh, I'm sure it does. I'm very sure it does. The corporation and the other manufacturers spend a great deal of money in racing. And they wouldn't do that if they didn't feel that it was selling cars. So you get to a lot of people. You get to an awful lot of people through racing.
What was the best job in your mind you ever had? The one you enjoyed the most at Oldsmobile?
Well, you're measuring it, and the one I enjoyed the most? Well, the many years of doing shows, working with the sales and advertising people and PR was probably the most enjoyable. Yeah, I like people. I like working with people. And, that was fun.
Well, which general manager did you like to work with the best?
Well,
Outside of Mr. Phelps.
The one I worked with a lot of them quite a bit. I did a number of jobs for Howard Carroll when he was general manager. I liked Howard. I liked Bob Cook. He was an awful nice guy.
Mr. Sanchez?
Yes, but I really never... I was at a different phase at that time where I didn't do much with the general manager at that time. Favorite all-time person that I worked for was John Bells. I guess because it was at an age where I was kind of growing up, young. I just admired him a great deal. The guy that I still look back on and, and I think he did more for me. Well, he didn't do any more for me than Howard Carroll did as far as helping me financially and this and promoting me and this sort of thing. Howard Carroll probably helped me as much as anybody there, but I don't know. Belts was a young guy then. I was a young guy, and we did other things together, and I just enjoyed it.
Carl, you were mentioning the GM Motorama cars. Now, those experimental cars, would one of them ever get out on the highway and be licensed and titled to...
No.
There just would be...
They didn't drive those?
No.
Oh, they drove them.
But I mean, there'd be no way that
but
they could be sold.
They would
to
not
an
be
individual.
sold. See, GM can't sell a car that doesn't have approved parts on it. Parts that are approved for production. It would not be licensed and out on a road to drive. I can't ever think of one. I suppose if they'd have gone through and made special well, they could be licensed, But they probably wouldn't sell them, because guys did drive those cars, and they would
Yes.
take them home.
I mean to an individual
I don't think so.
on the street. Well, what do they do with those Motorama cars? Where do they exist?
Well,
someplace?
I'm sure that they probably do exist someplace, many of them in somebody's collection. I don't know where.
What do you mean somebody's collection? How would that somebody get that
Well,
car?
They might be, well, we sell cars, you know, scrap cars that are not allowed to be licensed. We give them to schools.
Well, yes, but of course they remove the VIN plate. Where they do that?
They did, they don't anymore.
Oh, is that right?
No, they don't do that anymore. What they do now is they give them a junk title, and then it says cannot be driven, and they have to pay for it. They have a title on them now.
Oh, I
But,
see. But would one of those experimental cars go out like that?
no, I don't think so. They probably ended up being ground up. And if they do exist, they probably exist within GM or somebody who's a good friend of GM someplace. I don't know what would have happened to them.
I just wondered, do you remember the F-88?
Oh, sure.
How many, now we have a story that says F-88 3. Was there a 1 and a 2?
Well, I remember two.
An F-88 2?
I remember two of them. Yeah.
Oh.
They were two, they weren't the same car.
Oh,
They were two different cars, as I remember.
so you're saying one of them was an F-88?
It was an F-88. I remember F-88 was like 1954. Yeah. And then in, say, 1956, there was another F-88, but it was not the same car as that.
I see.
It had a different front end on it and a different rear end. It was a different car. We also had another one in there that was called something else, I believe.
Well, there was the Golden Rocket.
Yeah, that was
Delta
ugly.
88.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I don't know what happened to those cars. I bet they don't exist. They, you know, most of the show cars, any show car that we would have built, that I would have built, never got sold. It went to the scrap. It got
Crunched up.
Crunched up. Because it had parts on it that were not certified. And
Of course, maybe in the 50s we didn't certify things, did we?
I
Per
think
se.
we did. Yes, we did. Yeah. If they weren't production parts, we had to remove any experimental part that was on a car before we sold it, as long as I can remember.
Because there's a lot of funny cars out there with what I call experimental parts on them from that era.
at least we're hearing about some.
Yeah. Yeah.
Boy, I don't remember anything like that. Did you ever see one of those?
We've got a picture of a 48 or 49
Well,
What are you thinking?
Roberta's
Oh,
convertible
yes.
with
Yes,
a back
it was a
seat
48.
windshield.
It was
Or a convertible.
98 convertible, and it had supposedly a device in the back where you could run up a glass
Windshield.
partition to screen off the driver and passenger from the people in the back seat.
what do they call those?
Wasn't,
Courtesy screen.
wasn't available on production.
It was glass.
Well,
Anyhow.
that was a little bit before my time.
Yeah,
but
I know,
as far
but-
back as I can remember, and I don't know if I can remember
Yeah.
back that far, but as far
Sure.
back as I can remember, they did not sell any cars with experimental parts on them.
Okay, well, we're just curious.
There
Keep running
was
into
things
that.
in those days were somewhat different.
Oh, yeah.
There were
That's right.
things done that
A lot different.
a lot different.
But the 50s, they were sort of picking up a little bit more on the experimental, so I didn't think those were licensed and titled, but we're trying to determine if they really were and were let out
Well, I don't
for the
think those.
public to buy,
I don't think those cars.
like the Motorama cars, for instance.
I really don't think they were on the road. But I can't say for sure. But we used to build cars, and you know, you can put a manufacturer's plate on
Oh, sure, anything.
a tractor
Okay.
if you want it. And they'd drive those cars, and they were handmade cars.
Yeah.
But they never got sold.
Yep. any of those test cars that people were using for testing this, that, or the other thing all had parts like that.
Yeah. Yep. And we used a lot of manufacturer's plates back in those days, a lot more than we do now. I don't know, I jumped around all over the place.
No, no, that's okay. I think we've
Carl,
sort of
covered
a lot of
here,
ground
but,
there. When did you retire, Carl? From Oldsmobile, that is.
October of '86.
October of '86. Okay.
And then when did you come back in this special?
March of '88.
Oh.
Dave found out he was sick again. And
Dave
Gerard. He found out he was sick again. Well, he'd called me prior to that and asked me if I'd like to come back and work the summer on NASCAR. And I said, yeah, I'll come back for the summer. But, you know, that's all I'm interested in. I'm not interested in a full-time job.
Was that in '87?
That was in maybe the end of '87, around the first of the year. And then Dave found out he had cancer again, and he called me and says, can you come back early? And so I came back in March, and he was only at work 4 days, and he went in the hospital and never came back.
How many people do you have working for you over there?
Well, directly I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there's some people that work indirectly for me through one of the guys that does work for me has some truck drivers and people that take the display trailer. You are familiar with that big display trailer truck that we got around the country, but I have that.
Oh. Now, the name of your department is still Special Vehicles?
No.
No,
No, Dave's had, his company was CMA, and mine
What
is
did that stand for?
Corporate Management Activities, and mine is PVM, Performance Vehicle Management.
Okay.
Let's see, so you lease your service to the company?
Yes.
Is that through basically the sales side of the house?
Engineering.
Through engineering side of the house. Okay.
I work for Larry Lyon.
Oh, yes. And that's engineering and planning?
Engineering and planning. It's somewhat different than, he took over Lucas's and Len Myers' positions.
Well, Carl, why don't we, if it's all right with you, now we did talk with you about a picture in connection with this interview. Do you mind stopping some morning over there at Rogers and getting your picture taken?
No, I don't mind. Pictures?
You know
Yes,
Roger.
You know Roger. Yeah, I guess
You mentioned
do.
you knew Roger.
Yeah, so Roger and I started JCs together when I was kids.
Well, if you could stop around 8, like before you come into the office, that would help Roger. Because sometimes neither he nor Eric is there, or if Eric's working on something in the darkroom, he can't leave and take care of an assignment. But if he's prepared, knows, like, say, Monday morning, you might stop on your way, he'd be ready for you.
Well, I see Roger now.
Okay. But we don't want you to
You're in no
forget.
hurry about this.
No, just
No,
don't
we
want
didn't
you to
want
end
you
up
to
back in
overlook
Florida,
it.
and,
I probably am going to be here for a while, I think.
yeah.
Can we get you
Okay.
to sign the release here for us, too?
Sure.
We're gonna collect names.
Okay, when I started, I worked for Woody Breeding, who worked for Irv Henning and John Elms.
Okay.
Then I went to work for Hugh Burns, who worked for Don Perkins. And then I went to work for Claire Harrington
Directly.
directly.
Okay.
And while I worked for Claire Harrington, I worked for a number of chief engineers, assistant chief engineers, of which were John Belts, Harold Metzel, Jim Lewis. I worked for Jim Lewis for a while. Of course, I worked for Ted Lucas a number of times. And from Claire Harrington, I went to work directly for Hirschman for just not very long, a couple of years, or a year maybe. Then I went to work, I took George Hirschman's place, and I went to work for Jack Ridenauer, who worked for Don Perkins, and then George Jones. And Then from Jack Ridenour, I worked for Ron Haas, Ted Lucas once in the middle there. I missed him. And then Paul Muddy. And I worked for Carl Phelan for a very short time. And I worked for Dick Hill. Then I went to work for John Dodge. And then I went to work for Otto Kern, which I had.
Got quite a lineup.
Yeah, and I had a lot of. Many of those years, especially the years I worked for Claire Harrington, I didn't work for Claire Harrington. I worked for John Belts, and Jim Lewis, Bob Stifel for him, Bob Schultz, Ted Lucas, Howard Carroll, and some for Dorschmer, but not a lot for Dorschmer. That group right there, that's who I reported to for many years, many years. And whatever the extent of John Belts through Ron Haas was, that's really who I've worked for with those guys up there.
How was Mr. Stemple to work for?
Oh, he was a super guy. I think he is a super guy. I'll probably see him next week. Our NASCAR banquet's next week in New York, and he usually goes to that. Oh, I work for Frank Ball, too. By the way, who works for me now.
Isn't that interesting? It all turns around, doesn't it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'll shut off again.